Welcome to our fourth PowerPoint module for the semester. This week we're going to talk about place. And we'll talk about what we mean by place because it's a pretty broad term, right? But we're going to talk about physical environment, spatial environment, social environment, and how all of this is connected to health. And we'll also talk a bit about policy as well. Here are our objectives for the week. So as I said before, we're going to consider various dimensions of place and how these dimensions do shape health. And we're going to connect place to policy. So talking about housing policy, urban planning, taxation, and so on. You should take about an hour to complete this module. And if I've been way off with the time estimates, please let me know because I have a rough estimate, but these may take a lot more time, they may take a lot less time. So if I am way off, let me know. Here are your deliverables for the week. As usual, you have the reading question due Monday night, the PowerPoint module due Tuesday night, and we do have 4 parts to this module this time, but the video is very brief, so I still think it should take you within an hour. Then you also do have an assignment due this Friday, and that is your first take-home exam. The exam will be distributed on Enquire Tuesday night, and I will send you an email when it is available. But that is due Friday by 11:59 p.m. And there will be more instructions for how to submit it on the exam itself and in the email that I send out. I also have an important announcement for our class this week. I know that we had discussed possibly having our first in-class session for those who wanted it this week. However, because testing and the results of testing will likely be delayed on campus, I decided to push it a week. So at least at that point, by the week of September 21st or next week, I hope or expect that most students who are just moving to campus over this past weekend will have gotten their test results. If that is not the case, we can have another conversation, but I do plan for us to start our in-class sessions for those who choose to do them by the week of September 1st, and those would take place on Wednesdays. So Mondays would be the same. We'd still have the PowerPoint module posted on Mondays that you would complete by Tuesday. The only difference is that for students who choose to be face-to-face, they would come to class on Wednesday. For students who choose not to or cannot be face-to-face, they would meet on Zoom on Fridays, okay? So that's the change that we're planning, but that won't start until the week of September 21st, not this week. Let's start with your opening question, and this is your question for this week. Reflect on the place or places where you grew up. How do you think this place influenced your health? Now share what you're comfortable with sharing. This is a forum post. But I do want you to reflect on, how your own experiences growing up, specifically the place in which you lived, how did this affect your health? Or how do you speculate it affected your health? So at this point, you can pause the PowerPoint module and answer that question on Enquire. So when we talk about place, what do we mean? And there are multiple dimensions to places, right? We could think about the physical environment. And this might be what immediately comes to mind for us, like air quality, water quality, noise level, being in an urban environment compared to a rural environment. So these are descriptions of the physical environment, right? And we can certainly think about how all of these are connected to health. We also might consider the spatial environment, and that was the focus of one of your readings for this week, one of the empirical articles that you read. The distance to grocery stores, food deserts. This is a big topic within public health. We also might think about distance to green space or to libraries, other public services. And on the upper right-hand side of this slide, you see a map of local food sources for the Roanoke Valley. So this is an example of a way of analyzing or assessing the availability of grocery stores or distance to food sources. And then finally, we might consider the social environment, and this is also quite broad. Neighborhood social cohesion, so the connectedness amongst neighbors and amongst residents in a neighborhood. Maybe even the status or the strength of the labor market in the area. We might also consider crime and violence as indicators of a neighborhood's social environment. And this is by no means an exhaustive list of the ways that we could think about place or the different examples of place effects. But this is just to give you a general sense of what we really mean by place. Now I'm going to dive right into the two empirical articles that you read for this week. And by empirical, I mean that these articles actually had a quantitative study. They were testing something. It wasn't just a review of, the literature that exists. There actually is quantitative analysis in the Stevens article and then also in the Zenk article that you read. So let's start by talking about the Stevens article, Geographic Clustering of Diabetic Low Extremity Amputations in Low-Income Regions of California. So to briefly describe the design of this study, this is considered an ecological study design. And that means that our unit of analysis isn't the individual. We're not looking at individuals. We're looking at the aggregation of individuals. So the unit of analysis here is actually zip code. They looked at different zip codes and the populations within each of those zip codes. And what they did was map lower extremity amputations in adults with diabetes by their residential zip code, and then compared the amputation rates to a map of poverty rates. And they did do a bit more quantitatively than that, but we could actually just look at those two maps and be able to eyeball and see the comparison between the rate of these amputations and rates of poverty. And I do want to say quickly that amputation is a significant complication of diabetes. It is not especially common, but it is much more common in lower income individuals and also in Black and Hispanic patients. So we do see this, occur, but we see it occur at much different rates or frequencies depending on income and depending on race. And that suggests there is a health inequity here. But let's get back to the study and we're going to compare those two maps. So here's our first map. And this map is showing rates of lower extremity diabetic amputations per 100,000 adults. And they also do have an age limit here, so we're looking at ages 45 and older with diabetes. So we're looking at a specific subpopulation here. This is within Los Angeles County. This is from 2009, so it is a little bit dated, but I'm sure if we went back and we looked at these spatial relationships, we would still see a very similar pattern. So here we're looking at the differences in diabetic amputations in these different zip codes. And you see substantial differences across these zip codes, with the darker colors indicating a higher amputation rate and the lighter colors indicating a lower amputation rate. I'll admit I don't know a whole lot about Los Angeles County, but I bet if we were to look at the income and the resources available within these neighborhoods, we would see some pretty stark differences. And that leads us to our second map. All right, so this map is showing the proportion of households with income below 200% of the federal poverty level. This is the same geographic region. You'll notice that it looks very similar to the previous map. And I did want to note that they looked at 200% and below the poverty level. So they did this because they wanted to include those who were still very low income, but technically not below the poverty line. Because we know that the poverty line is actually not a great indicator of being low income or economically strained. The poverty line is very low. So those who are at double the poverty line are still experiencing limited income and are still struggling financially. That's why they chose 200% as their line. But if you look at this map, and mentally I hope you saved the previous map on the previous slide, but we do see significant overlap, right? If we look at the colors in this map and we compare it to what we were looking at in the previous slide, there definitely does appear to be a correlation between the level of or the amount of poverty in these various zip codes with the rate of these amputations due to diabetes. There's definitely a correlation here. So this is showing us spatially that there is a relationship between the poverty rate in a zip code and the rate of amputations related to diabetes. Here's a content question for you based on the Stevens et al. Article. So based on findings from Stevens and colleagues, can we conclude that neighborhood level poverty is causally related to lower extremity amputations among people with diabetes? Why or why not? I think this question is going to be a little bit easier for folks who have taken epidemiology already, but I want you to think about causal inference here. Can we say that area level or neighborhood level poverty is causally related to amputations among those with diabetes? Now let's move on to briefly cover the Zank article. We'll talk about both of these in more detail during our Zoom sessions this week. So Zank and colleagues were also doing an ecological study, meaning they weren't looking at individuals, they were looking at aggregates of individuals. And they were looking at the census tract level. An aside, a census tract, this is a common unit of analysis for a lot of research because the census does divide us into census tracts and into block groups below that. Anyway, this is a common level of analysis in a lot of social science and public health research. So they were looking at neighborhood racial composition, poverty, and the spatial accessibility of supermarkets in Detroit. And they did this by mapping the block distance to the nearest supermarkets for 869 different census tracts. So that's a lot of information. They looked at supermarkets specifically, and they didn't include things like convenience stores, like what is in the picture here, because convenience stores are typically not sources of fresh, healthy foods, right? It's a lot of processed food. So instead, they were looking at supermarkets, these larger grocery stores or grocery store chains that have a lot of options and do have fresh food options. And what they did was compare the distance to the nearest supermarket with the percentage of residents in poverty and also the percentage of non-Hispanic Black residents. So they were looking both by income of a neighborhood or an area and also the racial composition of an area. So here's what they found, and don't worry about really fully grasping all the spatial analysis language and what they did with the spatial analysis. I really want you to understand this figure. And I haven't done spatial analysis either, but we still can gain a lot of good information from the statistical skills that other people have. So if we look at this figure, we are comparing the poverty rate in a census tract to the distance to get to the nearest supermarket. So how far away is the nearest supermarket? And then across the x-axis, you see these different levels of how many people are in poverty. In addition, we have three different lines, right? We have trends for neighborhoods that have a low percentage of African Americans, those with a medium percentage, and those with a high percentage, meaning that those are primarily Black neighborhoods. If we look at these trends, we see that there's a flat line for neighborhoods with a low percentage of African Americans. So regardless of the poverty rate in these neighborhoods, there still is a relatively close supermarket. We don't see a difference in the distance to the nearest supermarket if we're in a primarily white neighborhood. That's what we see here. However, if we look at those with medium and high percentage of African Americans, so the racial composition is more African American than it is white, we do see that there is a major difference, especially when we get to high poverty. If we're in a low poverty area, the racial composition doesn't really matter. But if we're in a high poverty area, racial composition appears to matter a lot. Those neighborhoods that are either partially or mostly Black, that are also high in poverty, have to go much further to get to a grocery store. So what we're looking at here, we might call this the intersection of income and race, and how these interactively shape access to a grocery store. Now I want to spend a little time on the why question. So we see these huge disparities across neighborhoods in health and also disparities in social and economic conditions. How did we get here? Why do we see these inequalities? So I want you to pause the PowerPoint module and watch this brief, I think it's about 5 minutes, video called A Tale of Two Zip Codes. You may have seen this before. I think Dr. Ackley likes to use it as well. So if you've had a class with her and talked about the social determinants of health, you may have watched this. I want you to watch this brief video, and then based on the video, I want you to explain how A-Town and B-Ville became so different. And that'll make sense once you start watching the video. So pause here and watch the video and then answer that question on Inquire. Now, to expand on what you all wrote for your video question, I want to comment on how we got here. Why do we see these huge neighborhood disparities in health outcomes and access to important health promoting resources? This is not an exhaustive list, but we definitely need to consider at least these things. Political forces. The US and virtually all US cities have a long history of zoning laws and redlining that segregated neighborhoods by income and race. If you don't know what redlining is, you can look it up, but it is basically categorizing different neighborhoods based on the desirability of those neighborhoods, so to speak. And this was something that was government sanctioned, and then those rankings of neighborhoods were used in order to determine, well, who gets a mortgage loan, who gets a nice mortgage loan that they are able to afford, and who's essentially blocked from owning a home. We saw significant neighborhood differences in the growth of the middle class and home ownership, and this was driven by policy. And redlining was actually completed or done, or the scores for different neighborhoods were based on income and the racial composition of neighborhoods. And so this really did disadvantage those who are lower income or those who are non-white. So we do have political forces at play here. We could also talk about property taxes that fund neighborhood infrastructure. So taxes go into schools, taxes go into maintaining our streets and sidewalks and community resources. So this is another major political force. Cultural forces, and really what I'm talking about here is racism. We see the response of white people to integration, white flight from integrated neighborhoods, especially when there are real policy attempts to integrate neighborhoods. The blockage of policy initiatives that are meant to integrate neighborhoods, and typically this is those in the white middle class or white upper middle class who are pushing back against this integration. We could also look at economic forces, so specific to supermarkets. These chains are reluctant to open in low-income neighborhoods, particularly low-income neighborhoods that are primarily non-white. There are also other job-promoting industries that are reluctant to open in these low-income neighborhoods. And so we have multiple factors at play that really do keep residential segregation alive and that lead to huge, huge neighborhood-level disparities in health. And finally, I want to comment on what we can do. By we, I mean policymakers, humanity collectively. What can we do? We'll talk more about this in class, but I want to touch upon housing and urban planning as an important driver of residential segregation today, but also one really significant way to better integrate neighborhoods and improve neighborhood health. For example, if we wanted to have more integrated neighborhoods, we could develop policies that require a certain number of low-income housing units for all new housing developments. This has the goal of integrating housing by income. Enforcing non-discrimination laws for real estate lending. There are non-discrimination laws now. Redlining is illegal, but we continue to see real estate lending practices that are discriminatory. So enforcing these and finding ways to enforce them better. Tax policy. I think we've commented on this in our class this semester, but public education and community infrastructure, these are primarily funded through property taxes. And if you're in a low-income neighborhood, then there's less property tax that's going into the neighborhoods. So we shouldn't be relying on property taxes for funding public education and community infrastructure. Finally, thinking of ways to incentivize supermarkets and other businesses to open in low-income neighborhoods. And this might include some kind of a government voucher or system, something that would entice various businesses to actually open in neighborhoods where they wouldn't typically open. All of these require significant policy change. But all of these, in various examples, have been shown to really improve neighborhood health. We'll talk more about that in class. Here's your closing question. How might place, that is elements of physical, spatial, and social environment, shape the prevalence of the disease or health outcome you are studying for your course paper? So you might think about neighborhood inequalities and what these inequalities look like, and so on. So at this point, you can pause the PowerPoint module, answer the closing question, and then come back for the one last slide on what we're doing this week. For class this week, we are continuing, hopefully this will be the last week, but we'll be continuing with our Group A, Group B format, both on Zoom. There will be no in-class session this week. We're going to discuss the empirical articles you read in greater detail. We're going to consider connections to policy, and I want you to come prepared to discuss, as always. All right, I will see you on Zoom.